Deep in the Michigan woods, a stone mansion rises from the earth like a fortress. Inside its walls, a private powerhouse hums with electricity stolen from a diverted river. Outside, a line of workers stands silent, waiting for permission to enter through the servants' door they will never be allowed to forget exists. This is not the story they taught you in school. This is not the tale of an American hero who gave the world affordable automobiles and revolutionized industry. This is the story they buried in archives, the one hidden behind restoration brochures and museum gift shops. This is the dark empire behind Henry Ford's mansions, an empire built not just on steel and rubber, but on surveillance, control, and the systematic erasure of human dignity. What you're about to discover will change how you see every historical mansion, every Gilded Age estate, every carefully preserved monument to wealth. Because behind these walls lived people whose names were deliberately forgotten, people whose labor built palaces they could never inhabit, people whose lives were experiments in a vision so controlling, so invasive, so totalitarian in its reach that it makes modern corporate culture look gentle by comparison. Some of these mansions still stand today, polished and open for tour. Others have crumbled into ruins that local governments would prefer you never photograph. And one, deep in the Amazon rainforest, remains inhabited by the descendants of workers who survived what can only be described as an American colonial experiment on South American soil. If you're ready to see beyond the carefully curated museum narrative, if you want to understand how the mythology of American innovation was built on foundations of human control, stay with this investigation. Because what happened in these mansions didn't stay in these mansions. The systems tested behind these walls became the blueprint for how corporations would manage workers for the next century. Your support makes these deep investigations possible. If this is the kind of historical truth-telling you want to see more of, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which hidden empire you want exposed next. Let's begin where all empires of control begin, with a single house, and a single man's obsession with perfect order. The first thing you need to understand about Fair Lane is that it was never meant to be just a house. When Henry Ford and his wife Clara selected 1,300 acres along the Rouge River in Dearborn, Michigan, they weren't simply choosing a pleasant view or convenient location. They were creating a laboratory, a testing ground for theories about how human life should be organized, monitored, and optimized. Construction began in 1914, and from the very first architectural drawings, the house revealed its true purpose. Yes, there were 56 rooms spread across multiple wings. Yes, there was a powerhouse that would generate electricity from the river itself, making the estate completely self-sufficient. Yes, there were gardens designed by landscape architects who had studied the great estates of Europe. But look closer at those blueprints, the ones stored in archives that researchers need special permission to access, and you'll see something else entirely. You'll see a network of hidden corridors threading through the walls like veins through a body. Passages wide enough for a person to move through, but narrow enough that two could never pass comfortably. Staircases that descended into basements and ascended into attics, connecting every floor, every room, every space where the family might be to kitchens and storage areas where servants worked. These weren't architectural flourishes. They were infrastructure for invisibility. The servants at Fair Lane, numbering anywhere from 20 to 40 depending on the season and Ford's current projects, were expected to operate according to a principle that governed every aspect of the household: appear when needed, vanish when not. A bell system lined these hidden corridors. Each bell corresponded to a specific room, a specific need. When a bell rang, the sound echoed through passages where no family member would ever walk. A servant would emerge, perform whatever task was required, and disappear back into the walls. The family would experience seamless service. The workers would experience constant vigilance. Response time was monitored, though never officially. There were no time sheets for bell responses, no written policy about how quickly a servant should appear, but everyone who worked at Fair Lane understood that delays were noticed. That repeated slowness led to quiet conversations with the head housekeeper. That those conversations sometimes ended with a packed bag and a ride back to Detroit. This created something more insidious than a strict written code could ever achieve. It created internalized anxiety. Every servant carried in their body a constant awareness of possible observation. You could never be certain whether someone was timing you, whether your performance was being judged, whether this would be the day you failed some invisible standard. Clara Ford, by all accounts, treated the staff with genuine warmth. She remembered their names, asked about their families, showed concern during illnesses. Former servants who were interviewed decades later spoke of her kindness with real affection. But Clara's kindness operated inside a system she didn't design. The schedules, the bell system, the hidden corridors, the underlying philosophy that servants should be present but invisible, these belonged to Henry. And Henry Ford's beliefs about order, efficiency, and control shaped every inch of Fair Lane's operation. Ford rose before dawn most days. He believed early rising indicated moral character. He expected the household to reflect this belief. Kitchen staff began work while the estate was still dark, preparing breakfast according to specifications that changed based on Ford's latest dietary theories. And those theories were extensive. Ford became obsessed with soybeans in the 1930s, convinced they represented the future of human nutrition. Meals at Fair Lane increasingly featured soy milk, soy flour, soy-based substitutes for meat and dairy. Guests who came expecting the rich foods common at other wealthy estates instead encountered experimental dishes that many found barely palatable. But preference didn't matter. Food was fuel. Fuel should be optimized. Personal taste ranked below efficiency. This logic extended to every aspect of daily life at Fair Lane. Ford believed in the moral value of work and the danger of idleness. Even leisure time had to serve a purpose. Walks through the estate's extensive grounds doubled as inspections. Conversations with guests circled back to business philosophy and industrial theory. Reading materials reinforced existing convictions. There was no space, in other words, for genuine relaxation. No moment when the systems of optimization and control paused. Not for Ford himself, and certainly not for anyone else living under his roof. The staff felt this most acutely. Former employees, interviewed by historians long after Fair Lane had passed into other hands, described an atmosphere of constant low-level anxiety. You could work at Fair Lane for years and still never feel secure. Ford's moods were unpredictable. Rules that seemed clear one month might change without warning. Loyalty and long service earned you some protection, but not immunity. One woman, identified in archives only as MS, worked as a housemaid at Fair Lane for 7 years during the 1920s. Her account, preserved in a university oral history collection, describes a household where servants were well paid by the standards of the time, but emotionally exhausted by the constant vigilance required. She remembered being dismissed without warning after a single complaint from a guest about the temperature of bath water. 7 years of service, one mistake, 2 days' notice. When she tried to ask what she'd done wrong to understand how she might have corrected the error, she was told simply that Mr. Ford prefers a different arrangement. No explanation, no appeal, no conversation. She packed her belongings, left through the servants' entrance, and found herself on a road leading away from Fair Lane with no reference letter, no severance beyond her final week's pay, and no clear understanding of what had just happened to her life. This is the Empire's first lesson. Generosity and control are not opposites. They can exist simultaneously. In fact, generosity often makes control more effective because it creates gratitude that complicates resistance. Workers who might otherwise organize or protest find themselves hesitating, thinking about the good pay, the clean housing, the medical care that came with employment. Thinking it could be worse elsewhere. And they would be right. It could be worse. Often was worse. But that doesn't mean it was good. It just means the exploitation came wrapped in better packaging. Fair Lane was that packaging perfected. A house so beautiful that its systems of control became nearly invisible. Gardens so carefully maintained that you might not notice the laborers who maintained them. Service so seamless that you forgot entirely about the people providing it. The house still stands today, partially restored, open for tour. Visitors walk through rooms where Clara once arranged flowers and Henry once tested his latest inventions. They admire the craftsmanship, the imported materials, the ingenious engineering of the powerhouse. What they rarely see are the servants' quarters, the hidden staircases. The bell system that still exists in the walls, silent now, but no less present. The infrastructure of control preserved in limestone and wood, waiting for anyone curious enough to ask the question most tour never encourage. Who else lived here, And what did this house cost them? Fair Lane was the laboratory, but the experiment didn't stay contained within its walls. A few miles away, Ford was preparing to scale his vision, to apply the lessons learned in one mansion to hundreds of houses, to transform an entire neighborhood into an extension of his factory floor. The workers who lived in those houses would discover that the line between company employment and company control had disappeared entirely. That when your employer also becomes your landlord, when your workplace also becomes your community, when your boss also becomes the person who decides whether your children are being raised correctly, you haven't just accepted a job. You've entered an empire. And empires, as Fair Lane's servants already knew, always demand more than they promise. The houses appeared in rows, identical in every way that mattered. Brick construction, modest porches, small front yards with space for a garden, but not much more. Each home featured running water, indoor plumbing, gas heat, modern conveniences that millions of American families in the 1920s could only dream about. For workers at Ford's Rouge plant, these houses represented an almost unimaginable leap in quality of life. But the keys came with conditions, and those conditions revealed the true nature of what Ford was building. This wasn't a neighborhood. It was surveillance infrastructure disguised as corporate charity. Let's start with the most obvious control mechanism, the lease itself. Rent was tied directly and exclusively to employment at Ford Motor Company. This wasn't merely a preference or a priority system where Ford workers got first access. It was absolute. Work at Ford or lose your home. There was no separation, no buffer, no protection. Lose your job for any reason, performance, layoffs, injury, a disagreement with a foreman, and you lost your house. Usually within 30 days. Think about what this does to a person's willingness to complain, to organize, to push back against dangerous conditions or unfair treatment. When your family's shelter depends entirely on your continued employment, when your children's stability is hostage to your supervisor's mood, you learn very quickly to keep your head down and your mouth shut. But employment wasn't the only condition. It was just the beginning. Enter the Ford Sociological Department, an organization whose name sounds almost satirical now, but was completely serious then. Established in 1914, the same year Fair Lane began construction, the Sociological Department employed investigators whose job was to determine whether Ford workers deserved their wages. Yes, you read that correctly. Whether they deserved what they earned. Ford famously announced the $5 day in 1914, roughly doubling the average industrial wage at the time. Newspapers celebrated it as unprecedented generosity. Workers flooded to Detroit from across the country and around the world, desperate for those jobs. What the headlines rarely mentioned was that the $5 wasn't guaranteed. It was conditional. To qualify for the full wage, workers had to pass inspection, and those inspections were comprehensive, invasive, and ongoing. Sociological Department investigators, numbering more than 200 at the program's peak, visited workers' homes without warning. They checked for cleanliness. They examined how money was being spent. They asked about drinking habits, church attendance, whether children were in school, whether wives were managing households according to acceptable standards. They evaluated whether families were living in ways Ford considered appropriate for recipients of his generosity. In the company houses, these visits intensified. Investigators didn't just evaluate a worker's life. They evaluated the entire environment Ford had provided. Was the house being maintained properly? Were the yards kept to standard? Were neighbors reporting any problems? And here's where the system became truly insidious. Neighbors knew about the investigations. Everyone knew. And everyone knew that complaints could trigger a visit, could put someone's wage qualification at risk, could even result in eviction. This created an atmosphere of mutual surveillance. You watched your neighbors because you knew they were watching you. You kept your lawn trimmed not just out of personal preference, but because an unkempt yard might generate a report. You made sure your children were visible going to school because someone might notice if they were. The neighborhood that looked from the outside like a worker's paradise was actually a panopticon, a space where observation was constant and everyone participated in monitoring everyone else. A man we'll call Robert. His real name is lost to history, but his story survives in fragments from multiple sources. Moved into a Ford company house in 1923. He was a skilled machinist, well paid by the standards of the time, grateful for the opportunity to give his family a real home after years in crowded boarding houses. The first inspection came 3 weeks after he moved in. Two men in suits knocked on the door on a Tuesday afternoon, walked through every room, opened closets, checked the kitchen for cleanliness and proper food storage, and asked Robert's wife about their budget, their church attendance, their children's school records. Robert's wife, we'll call her Helen, answered every question with the careful politeness of someone who understood that these men held power over her life. She showed them the household ledger where she tracked expenses. She produced the children's report cards. She explained that they attended Baptist services every Sunday. The investigators made notes on clipboards. They nodded. They said everything looked satisfactory. Then they left. Helen closed the door behind them and cried for 20 minutes. The intrusion, the sense of being judged in her own home, the fear that she'd said something wrong or that the house hadn't been clean enough, all of it crashed down on her at once. And that was a successful inspection. Families that failed faced consequences ranging from wage reductions to mandatory classes on homemaking, budgeting, and proper American living for immigrant families. Repeated failures led to eviction. The classes themselves deserve attention. They were presented as educational opportunities, ways to help families succeed. In practice, they were cultural erasure programs. Immigrant families were taught that their traditional foods were inferior to American diets, that their languages should be replaced with English, not just in public but in their own homes, that their cultural practices, celebrating saints' days, maintaining extended family structures, following different religious calendars, were obstacles to becoming proper Americans. The goal wasn't diversity or inclusion. It was assimilation enforced through economic pressure. Accept Ford's vision of proper living or lose access to his wages and his housing. Some families internalized this completely. They adopted American dress, American names, American customs with an eagerness born of genuine desire to belong mixed with pure survival instinct. They became, in the language of the time, model citizens. Others resisted quietly. They maintained their traditions inside their homes while performing compliance in public. They spoke their native languages behind closed doors. They prepared traditional foods but made sure to have acceptable American meals visible when inspectors might visit. They learned to code switch, to maintain dual identities, one for survival and one for themselves. And still others simply couldn't sustain the constant performance. The pressure broke them. Families fell apart under the strain. Men started drinking, risking everything they'd worked for because the weight of constant surveillance became unbearable. Women suffered breakdowns. Children grew up internalizing the message that who they were, their heritage, their family's culture, was somehow shameful, something to be hidden or corrected. The neighborhood remained beautiful. The houses stayed well-maintained. The lawns stayed trimmed. From the outside, driving through these streets, you would have seen the picture of prosperity and order. You would have seen exactly what Henry Ford wanted you to see. You wouldn't have seen the anxiety that hummed through every home like electrical current. The careful calculations families made about what could be visible and what had to be hidden. The weight of knowing that your neighbor's observations could reach the Sociological Department faster than any friendship could intervene. By the 1930s, the Sociological Department began to wind down. The combination of growing worker resentment, increasing criticism from labor organizers, and the simple expense of maintaining such an extensive surveillance apparatus made the program unsustainable. But the houses remained, and the families living in them remained, and the habits formed under constant observation, the caution, the performance, the surveillance of self and others, those remained too, long after the official investigators stopped making their rounds. When Ford Motor Company finally sold the houses to individual buyers after World War II, many of the original families purchased the homes they'd been renting. For the first time, they owned the space they lived in. For the first time, no inspector could enter without permission. For the first time, they could paint their doors any color they wanted, plant whatever they liked in their gardens, live without the fear that someone was always evaluating, always judging, always ready to take it all away. The relief was profound, but so was the damage. Entire generations had grown up learning that privacy was conditional, that home was never truly yours, that security always came with surveillance attached. These lessons didn't vanish when the inspectors stopped coming. They were embedded too deeply, woven into too many assumptions about what work demands and what workers owe in return. The neighborhood still stands today. The houses are well maintained, many still occupied by descendants of the original families. Historical markers note the significance of the area. Tours occasionally pass through, guides pointing out the architectural consistency, the quality of construction, the forward-thinking provision of worker housing. What they rarely discuss is what it felt like to live under observation, what it cost families to maintain the appearance of perfection. How many people learned to hide parts of themselves so thoroughly that they forgot those parts existed. The Ford neighborhood was an experiment in total management, in extending corporate control beyond the factory gates into the most private spaces of workers' lives. And it worked. Not because workers loved it, though some did. Not because it created genuine community, though some of that emerged despite the system. Not because of it. It worked because it demonstrated that people will accept extraordinary intrusions into their autonomy if the alternative is losing everything they've built. It worked because it proved that surveillance doesn't require force when it's embedded in economic dependence. And most importantly, it worked because it established a template that other companies would study, adapt, and deploy for the next 100 years. But Ford wasn't finished testing his theories. The mansion had shown what control looked like in a single household. The neighborhood had shown what it looked like across hundreds of families. Now he was ready to scale up again. To build not just a factory town, but an American city in a foreign land. To impose his vision not just on workers who'd chosen to come to Michigan, but on an entire region of Brazil that had never asked for his intervention. To create Ford's ultimate experiment in total control, the one that would finally reveal the limits of his empire and the cost of his certainty. Before we travel to the Amazon, we need to understand something crucial about how empires reproduce themselves. We need to see what happened when Henry Ford's vision collided with his own son's dreams. Because the story of Edsel Ford and his lakeside mansion reveals another dimension of the empire, the way control operates even within families, even between people who supposedly love each other. Edsel Bryant Ford was born in 1893, the only child of Henry and Clara. He grew up at Fair Lane, surrounded by his father's experiments in efficiency and order. He learned early that in his father's world, everything had a purpose, everything had an optimal form, and deviation from that form was waste to be eliminated. But Edsel possessed tastes that deviated profoundly from his father's vision. He loved art, modern art, European design, architecture that prioritized beauty over utility, music that had no function beyond pleasure. Everything, in other words, that Henry Ford viewed with suspicion at best and contempt at worst. The tension between them defined Edsel's entire adult life. Henry made Edsel president of Ford Motor Company in 1918, when Edsel was just 25 years old. On paper, this was a position of immense power. In practice, Henry undercut Edsel's authority constantly. He overruled decisions, reversed appointments, went around his son to give orders directly to plant managers who knew where real power lay. Edsel wanted to modernize the company's designs, to compete with General Motors' more stylish offerings. Henry insisted on continuing to produce the Model T unchanged for years after the market had moved on. When Edsel finally convinced the company to retire the Model T and develop the Model A, Henry took credit for the decision. This dynamic, a father giving his son authority in name while systematically denying him power in practice, created in Edsel a desperate need for one space where he could make decisions that wouldn't be overturned. One place where his vision could exist without his father's veto. That place was Gawkler Point. Construction began in 1926 on a property along Lake St. Clair, northeast of Detroit. Edsel hired Albert Kahn, the architect famous for designing Ford's revolutionary factory buildings. But instead of industrial steel and glass, Kahn gave Edsel something completely different. A Cotswold manor house that looked like it had stood in the English countryside for centuries. Hand-cut limestone walls, leaded glass windows, a slate roof with chimney stacks that seemed to grow organically from the stone. Inside, rooms that flowed into one another with a warmth Fair Lane's more rigid corridors never achieved. And throughout the house, art that would have made Henry Ford uncomfortable. Edsel and his wife Alina filled their home with works by Diego Rivera, Paul Cézanne, Henry Matisse. Paintings and sculptures that challenged, that provoked, that represented everything Henry Ford found suspicious about modern culture. The walls became a gallery of quiet rebellion, a statement in oil and bronze that said, "In this house, beauty matters more than function." Elinor supported this vision completely. She shared Edsel's love of art and his belief that wealth carried responsibility to support culture, education, and social progress. Together, they created a home that stood as a direct counter-argument to everything Fair Lane represented. Where Fair Lane was about control, Gawkler Point was about grace. Where Fair Lane was about efficiency, Gawkler Point was about beauty. Where Fair Lane servants moved through hidden corridors, Gawkler Point staff worked in spaces that acknowledged their presence and dignity. But here's what you need to understand. Even this more humane house still rested on the same foundation. The money that bought the limestone and the Matisse paintings came from the Rouge plant. The leisure that allowed Edsel and Elinor to discuss art and architecture was purchased by workers whose leisure time was monitored by Ford's investigators. Elinor understood this. Her diary entries, preserved in archives, reveal a woman deeply aware of the contradictions she lived inside. She genuinely cared about workers' welfare. She supported labor reform. She donated generously to causes that her father-in-law actively opposed. And yet she never truly confronted the source of her own comfort. How could she? To do so would require dismantling not just her lifestyle, but her marriage, her children's future, her entire social position. So instead, she managed the contradiction through philanthropy, through careful support of causes that mattered, through a kind of progressive gentility that acknowledged problems without threatening systems. Edsel's position was even more constrained. Every day he went to work in a company where his title meant nothing, where his father's lieutenants reported his activities back to Henry, where his decisions were subject to veto by a man who refused to acknowledge that the world had changed since 1914. The stress manifested physically. By his 30s, Edsel suffered from stomach problems that doctors struggled to diagnose. By his 40s, the symptoms had worsened to the point that he could barely eat. His weight dropped. His energy faded. He moved through Gawkler Point's beautiful rooms like a ghost, haunting his own house. In 1943, at the age of 49, Edsel Ford died. The official cause was stomach cancer, but everyone close to the family understood that his father had killed him. Not with a weapon, not with poison, but with decades of systematic humiliation. With the constant message that nothing Edsel did was quite good enough, that his judgment couldn't be trusted, that his vision didn't matter. Henry Ford outlived his son by 4 years. He died in 1947 during a power outage at Fair Lane by candlelight, surrounded by the systems of control he'd built, and that had ultimately isolated him from genuine human connection. Elinor Ford remained at Gawkler Point, raising her children, maintaining the house and gardens that had given Edsel brief respite from his father's empire. She lived until 1976, long enough to see the company pass through multiple generations, long enough to witness the civil rights movement and women's liberation, and all the social changes that made her father-in-law's worldview seem increasingly archaic. And before she died, Elinor made a decision that Henry Ford would never have made. She donated Gawkler Point to a public trust. The house, the grounds, the art collection, all of it would be preserved and open to anyone who wanted to visit. The estate that had been a private retreat would become a public resource. This was an act of genuine generosity, but it was also an admission. Elinor knew that without legal protection, the estate would be sold, subdivided, turned into condominiums or corporate offices. She knew that private wealth, unregulated and unbound, consumes itself. That without structures forcing preservation and access, beauty becomes just another commodity to be exploited and discarded. So she created those structures. She used her wealth to ensure that the place her husband had built as an escape from his father's control would survive as a reminder of what wealth could be at its best. Not a tool for domination, but a resource for shared cultural enrichment. It's a redemptive ending to a tragic story, but it doesn't erase the tragedy. Edsel Ford spent his entire life trying to create space for beauty and dignity within an empire built on control. He succeeded in building one house, but he couldn't escape the empire itself. It was in his blood, in his bank account, in every relationship he had that was shaped by who his father was and what his father had built. The gilded cage was beautiful. It was filled with masterpieces. It overlooked a lake that caught the sunrise in ways that made you believe the world could be redeemed through beauty alone. But it was still a cage, and Edsel died inside it, having never truly escaped the shadow of Fair Lane. This is what empires do to families. They create hierarchies that wound even those at the top. They poison relationships with power dynamics that love alone can't overcome. They trap everyone inside systems that serve the vision of one person, one generation, one moment of certainty that hardens into unchangeable stone. And in Brazil, Ford was building a cage on an unimaginable scale, not for one son but for thousands of workers. Not on a few acres of Michigan lakefront, but on 2.5 million acres of Amazon rainforest. Not as a private home, but as an entire civilization, designed from scratch, imposed on people who'd never asked for it, and doomed from the start by the same fatal combination of vision, certainty, and refusal to listen that had defined everything Henry Ford built. In 1927, Henry Ford acquired land in Brazil that dwarfed everything he'd built in Michigan. 2.5 million acres in the Amazon basin, along the Tapajos River, an area larger than the state of Connecticut. The Brazilian government, desperate for foreign investment and eager to encourage development of the Amazon's interior, offered terms so favorable they bordered on surrender of sovereignty. Ford would have complete control over this territory. He could build what he wanted, govern how he wanted, extract resources without restriction. The plantation he created would pay no export taxes for 50 years. In exchange, he promised to bring jobs, infrastructure, and American know-how to a region Brazil had never managed to fully integrate into its economy. On paper, the deal made sense. Ford Motor Company consumed rubber by the ton, and nearly all of it came from British and Dutch plantations in Southeast Asia. World War I had demonstrated the strategic danger of this dependence. A domestic, or at least Western Hemisphere, source of rubber appeared to be simple business logic. But this was never just about rubber. Ford saw the Amazon the same way he'd seen the muddy farmland along the Rouge River, as raw material waiting to be organized. The jungle was chaos. His job was to impose order. The local population was labor waiting to be improved. His job was to transform them into proper workers, proper Americans, proper subjects of his industrial vision. Fordlandia, the name eventually given to the plantation, began rising from the jungle in 1928. American managers arrived with blueprints drawn in Michigan. They laid out streets in rigid grid patterns, perpendicular intersections that made perfect sense on flat land, but ignored the Amazon's terrain entirely. They constructed houses in American Midwest styles, clapboard siding, pitched roofs designed to shed snow that would never fall, front porches facing across streets that baked in equatorial heat. A water tower went up, stamped with the Ford logo. It became the plantation's defining landmark, visible from the river, announcing to everyone who approached that this land now belonged to Henry Ford's vision. The plantation was designed to accommodate 10,000 workers and their families. There would be a hospital, schools, stores, recreation facilities. Not just a workplace, but an entire city, a complete social system exported from Michigan to Brazil with the assumption that what worked in one place would automatically work everywhere. The first workers arrived in 1929. Many came from the surrounding region, drawn by wages that seemed miraculous compared to what they could earn elsewhere. Others came from Brazil's urban centers, desperate for work during global economic depression. They arrived expecting a job. What they found was something much more comprehensive and much more invasive. Employment at Fordlandia meant accepting American housing, American food, American schedules, and American supervision of virtually every aspect of life. The cafeteria served oatmeal, whole wheat bread, canned vegetables, and other foods Ford believed promoted health and efficiency. Local dishes were discouraged. Traditional foods were treated as problems to be corrected. Workers who had lived their entire lives in the Amazon, who understood the region's rhythms and requirements, found themselves being instructed by American managers who'd never left Michigan until 6 weeks ago. The disconnect was total and immediate. Rubber trees produce best when tapped in the cool hours before dawn. Local tappers knew this from generations of experience. Ford's managers imposed factory shifts, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. with a lunch break, just like in Dearborn. The trees suffered. Production fell short of targets from the very beginning, but production problems were only part of the disaster unfolding at Fordlandia. The housing assignments replicated and amplified racial and national hierarchies that Ford took for granted. American managers lived in larger houses on higher ground, with better ventilation and screened windows. Brazilian workers were placed in smaller structures closer to the river, where mosquitoes bred in standing water and malaria moved through entire neighborhoods in waves. The physical layout of the town communicated a vision of order that placed American lives above Brazilian lives, white bodies above brown bodies, managers above workers in ways that were architectural before they were even spoken. Alcohol was prohibited completely. The Amazon had deep traditions of local brewing, drinks fermented from native fruits, social spaces where workers gathered after exhausting days. Fordlandia banned all of it. In its place, the company organized approved recreation, square dances, poetry readings, gardening competitions. Entertainment that might feel normal in Michigan felt bizarre and insulting in the jungle heat. Imagine for a moment that you're a young man named Joe. You've lived along the Tapajos River your entire life. You know which fish run when, which fruits ripen in which season, which paths through the forest stay passable during the rains. You speak Portuguese with some indigenous vocabulary mixed in from your grandmother who grew up in a traditional community upstream. One day, men arrive offering wages that could change your family's life. You sign papers you can't fully read, board a boat, and arrive at a town that looks like nothing you've ever seen. Identical houses in straight lines, a water tower with English words. People shouting instructions in a language you don't speak. You're assigned a house. It has wooden walls that trap heat and a roof that makes the interior feel like an oven by noon. You're given a meal ticket for the cafeteria. The food there is pale and tasteless, nothing like the fish and manioc and fruits you grew up eating. You go to work. American supervisors position you in front of a rubber tree and show you how to tap it, even though your father taught you this skill when you were 8 years old. But their method is different, done at the wrong time of day in a way that will stress the tree and reduce future production. You try to explain this. The supervisor doesn't understand Portuguese. He repeats his instructions louder as if volume will create comprehension. You return to your house at the end of the shift. Your neighbors speak different languages, come from different regions. The old man next door is from Sao Paulo. The family across the street speaks an indigenous language you don't recognize. There's no natural community here, just people thrown together by employment. You're exhausted. You want a drink, want to relax with music and conversation. But the social clubs are closed, alcohol is forbidden, and the company is showing an American film in the rec hall, subtitled in Portuguese so awkward it's almost unintelligible. You lie in your hot wooden house, listening to unfamiliar sounds, eating food that doesn't satisfy, working in ways that make no sense, and slowly understanding that this job has required you to surrender not just your time but your entire way of life. Now multiply Joe's experience by thousands. Imagine that tension, that cultural dislocation, that daily accumulated resentment spreading through an entire workforce. Imagine it building month after month, with no outlet, no acknowledgement from management that anything might be wrong. What happened next was inevitable. December 1930. The wet season had turned Fordlandia's streets into rivers of mud. The hospital was overwhelmed with malaria cases. Morale had never been high, but now it had sunk to levels that made even the American managers nervous. Then came the announcement about the cafeteria. Workers would no longer be served at tables. Instead, they would line up, receive food on trays, and eat in scheduled shifts. Factory-style efficiency applied to digestion. It was a small change in procedural terms. In symbolic terms, it was enormous. For men who had endured months of foreign food, foreign rules, foreign supervisors who showed no interest in learning Portuguese or understanding local customs, this felt like the final insult. The line between order and humiliation had been crossed too many times. This time, something broke. It started with shouting, voices rising over the clatter of trays, arguments about dignity, about respect, about being treated like human beings rather than parts on an assembly line. Then plates began to fly. Workers overturned tables, smashed windows, hurled kitchen equipment into the muddy streets. Within minutes, the cafeteria was unrecognizable. Pots and pans crashed against walls. Glass shattered across floors. The neat, controlled space that was supposed to demonstrate American efficiency had erupted into chaos. The American managers ran. Some fled to the docks and commandeered boats, pushing off into the Tapajos River and watching from the water as the town they designed, the civilization they'd tried to impose came apart in front of them. Brazilian military forces arrived and restored order within hours. Rifles and discipline did what labor management never could, forced compliance. The physical damage was extensive but ultimately repairable. Broken furniture could be replaced. Windows could be reglazed. What couldn't be repaired was the illusion. Fordlandia had been built on the belief that American systems, properly applied, could transform any environment and any population. The riot exposed what local workers had known from the beginning. You can impose systems, but you can't impose meaning. You can control behavior through force and economic dependence, but you can't make people believe in your vision just because you're paying them. And beneath the cultural conflict, a deeper disaster was unfolding, one that no amount of military intervention could solve. The rubber trees were dying. Ford's planners had made a catastrophic error, one that local agricultural experts had warned about from the beginning, and that had been systematically ignored. In Southeast Asia, where British and Dutch plantations thrived, rubber trees grew in carefully spaced rows. Those trees had been transplanted from the Amazon generations ago, leaving behind the diseases and pests that had evolved alongside them. In Brazil, those diseases still existed. South American leaf blight, a fungal infection that had always been present in the rainforest, was normally kept in check by the natural spacing of wild rubber trees. In nature, rubber trees grow scattered through the forest, separated by dozens of other species. The fungus couldn't easily jump from one tree to the next, but Ford's managers had planted their trees exactly like the successful Asian plantations, in dense, uniform rows, perfect geometry, maximum efficiency, and perfect conditions for disaster. The fungus leapt from leaf to leaf, tree to tree, spreading through the groves faster than botanists could track. Leaves blackened and fell. Branches died. Entire sections of the plantation, representing millions of dollars in investment, withered and had to be cleared. Local experts explained the problem. The traditional way of growing rubber in the Amazon, scattered trees integrated into the existing forest, wasn't primitive ignorance. It was sophisticated understanding of the ecosystem. The inefficient spacing that Ford's planners had rejected was actually the only method that could work in the Amazon's disease environment. But acknowledging this would require admitting that local knowledge was superior to American expertise, that indigenous and caboclo rubber tappers understood something Ford's engineers didn't, that the whole premise of the plantation, bringing American rationality to organize the chaos of the jungle, was fundamentally backwards. Ford doubled down instead. In 1934, a second site called Belterra was established on supposedly better terrain with improved drainage and soil. More money flowed south. New equipment was shipped up the river. Fresh managers arrived with fresh optimism and the same fundamental blind spots. The pattern repeated. American-style houses in the jungle heat, American food in the cafeteria, American work schedules that ignored local conditions, and rubber trees planted in dense rows that the leaf blight would inevitably find and destroy. Meanwhile, workers adapted in the only ways available to them. They smuggled alcohol past company inspectors and drank in secret. They prepared traditional foods in their homes when supervisors weren't watching. They maintained their own social rhythms and cultural practices beneath the official schedules, creating parallel systems of life that the company either couldn't see or couldn't eliminate. The town that was supposed to transform them had itself been transformed. The neat American grid remained, but the life inside it bore little resemblance to what Ford's blueprints had envisioned. Fordlandia became a hybrid space, American in appearance but Brazilian in actual function, a monument to the limits of imposed order. Henry Ford himself never visited Fordlandia, not once. He directed the entire project from Dearborn, studying reports and photographs, issuing orders based on information filtered through layers of managers who knew their careers depended on telling him what he wanted to hear. For Ford, the jungle existed as an abstraction. Lines on a map, numbers in a ledger, a problem to be solved through the firm application of American principles. He never felt the heat or fought the mosquitoes or saw the faces of workers trying to explain that his systems didn't fit their reality. This distance, this abstraction, is crucial to understanding how empires function. The people making decisions are insulated from the consequences of those decisions. They live in comfortable homes thousands of miles away. They receive filtered information that confirms their existing beliefs. They never have to look into the eyes of the people whose lives they're disrupting. And when the projects fail, as Fordlandia was clearly failing by the late 1930s, the people at the top don't pay the price. They write off the losses. They move on to other ventures. They might feel disappointed, might feel frustrated that lesser people couldn't execute their vision properly, but they don't suffer. The workers suffer. The families who uprooted their lives for promised wages suffer. The environment damaged by poorly planned development suffers. But suffering, when it happens far away to people who don't speak your language, is easy to ignore. By the time World War II ended, Fordlandia and Belterra had produced virtually no commercial rubber. The development of synthetic rubber during the war had eliminated the strategic need for natural sources anyway. In 1945, Ford Motor Company sold both plantations back to the Brazilian government for roughly $250,000, a tiny fraction of the estimated $20 million that had been invested. The company's official statement described the project as an interesting experiment that had served its purpose. There was no acknowledgement of failure, no apology to the thousands of workers whose lives had been disrupted. No recognition that maybe, possibly, the whole enterprise had been a colossal exercise in arrogance. The American managers packed up and left. The water tower remained, Ford's logo still visible on its rusted surface. And the workers, the Brazilian families who'd built the town and lived through its chaos and survived its collapse, stayed. Because they had nowhere else to go. Because their homes, however inadequate, were still homes. Because life, even in the ruins of someone else's failed vision, was still life. Fordlandia should have been a footnote, an embarrassing corporate failure forgotten as soon as the last accountant filed the final loss report. Instead, it became something stranger and more important, a living reminder of what happens when empires collide with reality, when certainty meets complexity, when the people with power refuse to listen to the people with knowledge, and against all expectations, the town survived. Not as Ford imagined it, but as something created by the people who refused to vanish just because the company that created their town had lost interest. Henry Ford died in April 1947 during a power outage at Fair Lane. The man who'd built his own hydroelectric plant, who'd insisted on self-sufficiency in every domain, passed away by candlelight when the Rouge River flooded and knocked out his generators. There's a metaphor in that image, the systems he'd built failing him at the moment of his death, leaving him in darkness despite all his engineering prowess. But I won't belabor the symbolism. The facts are stark enough. Clara followed him within 3 years. The house that had hummed with controlled activity, where Bell systems summoned servants and hidden corridors channeled human movement according to strict protocols, fell silent. The Ford Motor Company maintained the property for a while, unsure what to do with a 56-room estate that no one wanted to occupy. Eventually, Fair Lane passed to the University of Michigan Dearborn. The university lacked funds for proper restoration. Decades of deferred maintenance piled up. Water seeped through stone walls. Wooden beams rotted in places visitors would never see. The gardens that Clara had loved grew wild, then overgrown, then nearly impenetrable. The powerhouse that had showcased Ford's attempt to master nature fell silent, its turbines rusting in place, its original purpose fading from institutional memory. Fair Lane wasn't alone in its decline. The Ford Rotunda, a massive exhibition hall that had welcomed millions of visitors, burned to the ground in 1962 during roof repairs. The fire consumed the entire structure in less than an hour. Photographs from that day show smoke rising over Dearborn like a funeral pyre for an entire era. Other landmarks simply vanished, demolished to make way for parking lots and low-rise offices. The physical infrastructure of Ford's empire was erased piece by piece, replaced by developments that bore almost no trace of what had stood there before. But some pieces survived, and their survival reveals different possibilities for how we remember complicated histories. Eleanor Ford, who'd lived at Gawkler Point through decades of change, understood exactly what would happen to the estate without protection. The Lake St. Clair shoreline was valuable real estate. Without intervention, the house would be sold to developers. The grounds would be subdivided. The art collection would be scattered through auction houses and private collections, never to be reassembled. In 1976, she donated everything to a public trust. The house, the grounds, the art collection, all of it would be preserved and open to visitors. What had been a private sanctuary would become a public resource. This wasn't pure altruism. Elinor had the wealth to afford generosity. She lived a life of extraordinary privilege, but it was still a meaningful choice. She could have left everything to her children, could have trusted that wealth would preserve itself. Instead, she created legal structures that forced preservation and public access. The docents who lead tour at what's now called the Edsel and Elinor Ford House tell carefully curated stories. The art receives extensive attention. The architecture earns detailed explanation. Visitors learn about the family's collecting habits, their support for Diego Rivera, their role in Detroit's cultural development. What appears less often in these narratives are the workers, the servants who maintained those perfect rooms, the gardeners who kept the grounds immaculate, the chauffeurs and mechanics and cleaning staff whose labor made the whole beautiful operation function. They appear mostly in footnotes and side comments, background to the main story of artistic patronage and architectural achievement. This selective memory isn't unique to the Ford House. It's how wealth prefers to be remembered. As culture rather than extraction, as patronage rather than payroll, as beauty rather than labor. In Dearborn, the worker housing district survived through a combination of chance and stubbornness. Some original families stayed, passing houses from one generation to the next. Others left, replaced by new residents who knew nothing about the Sociological Department or the home inspections or the conditional nature of those original leases. Eventually, the neighborhood earned historic designation. This protected it from wholesale demolition, but also created new tensions. Historic preservation comes with restrictions. Residents found themselves subject to rules about paint colors, window replacements, architectural modifications. Some welcomed these limits as protection against developers. Others resented trading one form of control for another. The houses look much as they did nearly a century ago. The stories behind those brick walls and trimmed hedges remain harder to access. Some longtime residents became informal historians, collecting documents and recording oral histories before the last people who remembered the early days were gone. Others preferred to forget, to move forward without dwelling on how their families had lived under surveillance. Both responses make sense. Memory is not neutral. Remembering trauma serves some purposes and harms others. Forgetting creates space to build new identities. There's no single correct approach to inheriting complicated histories. And in Brazil, Fordlandia entered its strangest chapter. Not as a functioning plantation, not as an abandoned ruin, but as something in between. A place where the past refuses to fully disappear but also refuses to define the present. The water tower still bears the Ford logo. Rust has softened its edges, but the name remains visible from the river. A metal landmark pointing toward a town that was supposed to die but didn't. Fordlandia today is home to roughly 3,000 people. Not ghosts, not tourists. Families who wake each morning in houses built for American rubber workers, who send their children to schools constructed with Michigan money, who maintain lives in a place that was supposed to be temporary and became permanent. When Ford sold the plantation in 1945, conventional wisdom said the town would disappear. The company was gone. The economic reason for the settlement's existence was gone. The jungle everyone assumed would quietly reclaim what remained, but people don't follow corporate logic. The workers who'd built their lives at Fordlandia saw no reason to leave simply because distant shareholders had lost interest. The houses still stood. The hospital still functioned, at least basically. The cleared land, however poorly suited for rubber, could grow other crops, so they stayed, and decades passed. And something remarkable happened. The town that had been designed as an instrument of corporate control was slowly transformed into something created by the people who lived there. The American machinery rusted in place, too heavy to move, too expensive to repair. Children grew up playing in abandoned warehouses, turning conveyor belts into climbing equipment, making the industrial ruins into landscape. A teacher named Lucia, her students know her simply as Professora, now leads lessons no curriculum in Dearborn ever imagined. She walks classes through the old plantation rows, pointing out where rubber trees once stood before blight destroyed them. She shows them the managers' houses on the hill, still larger and better ventilated than the workers' quarters below. She explains what those differences meant, what they mean now, how architecture communicates ideology, how space is never neutral. Her teaching isn't about cultivating resentment. She's not trying to make children hate Americans or mistrust foreigners. She's teaching them to understand their own history without being trapped by it. To recognize that Fordlandia's origin story is strange and colonial and marked by profound cultural arrogance, and also that what the town has become is theirs, created by their grandparents and parents, shaped by decades of adaptation and resistance and simple, stubborn survival. Researchers arrive periodically, drawn by Fordlandia's status as a failed utopia. Photographers frame shots of decaying infrastructure wrapped in vines. Journalists write articles about hubris and colonialism. Documentary filmmakers capture footage of the rusted water tower and abandoned warehouses. The residents have learned to accommodate these visitors without letting them define the town's identity. Yes, Fordlandia has an unusual origin. Yes, the ruins make striking photographs. But this isn't a museum. It's a place where people work and argue and fall in love and worry about money and raise children and live complete, ordinary lives that have nothing to do with Henry Ford. Some of the old buildings have found new purposes. A warehouse stores agricultural equipment. A former administrative office houses a clinic. The building used for company meetings now hosts church services and community gatherings. The infrastructure of control has been quietly repurposed to serve needs Ford's planners never considered because they never asked what the community wanted. Reforestation projects have begun replacing failed rubber groves with native species. Young people who might once have migrated to cities find work in environmental restoration, turning the site of an ecological disaster into a laboratory for recovery. Fordlandia has become something Henry Ford would never understand. A place that belongs to the people who live there, not to the company that built it. A reminder that control, no matter how total it seems at first, eventually hits limits. That people outlast systems. That communities form in the ruins of empires. The town's survival is not a redemption of Ford's vision. It's a rejection of it. The buildings remain because they're useful, not because anyone venerates their designer. The grid layout persists because changing it would be more work than it's worth, not because anyone believes in its underlying logic. This is how empires actually end, not with dramatic collapse but with slow transformation. The physical structures remain while their meaning drains away. The systems persist as shells that people fill with their own purposes. What was built to control becomes just landscape, just architecture, just material that can be repurposed for whatever needs arise. The Ford logo on the water tower is fading. In another generation, it might become illegible. Children will grow up seeing it as a pattern of rust rather than a symbol of power. The name Fordlandia will persist because places need names, but the weight attached to that name, the history it carries, that will gradually lighten as people who remember firsthand die and are replaced by people who know the story only from school lessons and family anecdotes. This isn't forgetting exactly. It's the normal process by which the past becomes past, by which urgent lived experience becomes distant history, by which the empire that once felt permanent becomes something people learn about in museums and classrooms. And in Michigan, a similar transformation was underway. The physical remnants of Ford's empire were being preserved, studied, and reinterpreted by people who hadn't lived through them, who could look at the houses and mansions with some critical distance, who could ask questions that would have been dangerous or unthinkable when the empire was at its height. Catherine sits in a lawyer's office in Detroit, reviewing documents that will determine the future of a house her grandmother purchased in 1952. 3 generations have lived within its walls. Now she must decide whether to keep it, sell it, or donate it to a historical organization. The market value has increased roughly 100-fold since her grandmother signed the original deed. The developers who have contacted her talk about opportunity, about unlocking value, about the lot being worth more than the aging house that sits on it. But Catherine is thinking about a different kind of value, one that doesn't appear in real estate listings or tax assessments. Her grandmother rarely spoke about the early years of living in the house when it was still Ford Company property. The inspection visits, the unease of living under standards that were never fully explained but always enforced. The way neighbors watched each other, not out of community care but out of mutual surveillance. These memories appeared only in scattered comments, fragments that Catherine collected without fully understanding their significance. Now, holding the deed, looking at documents that put her in control of property that once controlled her grandmother, she's beginning to grasp what that history means. Her grandmother didn't just buy a structure in 1952. She bought the power to decide. She bought freedom from conditions that had governed the property since its construction. She bought autonomy that had been denied for decades. The question now, what will Catherine do with that autonomy? She's far from alone in facing this choice. Across Dearborn, across the former Ford empire, descendants are confronting questions of inheritance that reach beyond simple property transfer. What obligations come with owning a piece of this history? Which stories are attached to the bricks and wood? Who has the right and responsibility to tell those stories? Some inheritors have placed preservation easements on their properties, legally binding agreements that protect historic features even if the house is sold. Others have donated homes to historical societies or community trusts. A few have opened doors for occasional tour, becoming informal curators of their own family archives. There's no single correct answer. The houses are too numerous, too varied in condition, too differently situated to allow one rule. Each inheritor weighs personal needs against historical significance, immediate financial pressure against long-term preservation, individual rights against community interest in memory. Slowly, almost organically, a network has formed. Descendants find each other in online forums, trading scans of old inspection reports and pay stubs. Local gatherings bring together owners from different streets to compare notes on maintenance, zoning battles, preservation strategies. What's emerging is a collective awareness that these scattered properties, individually owned, amount to a shared inheritance, that no single person can protect or interpret this history alone. That preservation requires coordination and cooperation in ways that cut against the individualism Ford himself championed. Catherine hasn't made her decision yet. She's requested time to think, time to walk through the house again, to sit at the kitchen table where her grandmother served meals for 50 years, to stand in the yard that was once subject to company inspection and is now simply, undeniably, her family's ground. The empire Ford built was designed to endure beyond any individual life. The factories he believed would outlast workers. The houses would outlast tenants. The systems of control would perpetuate themselves as names on office doors changed. It hasn't worked that way. The factories have mostly closed or been repurposed. The formal systems of control have collapsed. What remains are properties held by individuals who must decide, one by one, what to preserve, what to alter, what to let go. This dispersal of the empire, its fragmentation into hundreds of individual decisions, is probably the best outcome anyone could hope for. Centralized control, even when exercised by institutions claiming public interest, tends to reproduce the problems it's trying to address. Museums present carefully managed narratives. Historic sites emphasize what's photogenic and downplay what's uncomfortable. Individual owners, making decisions for their own complicated reasons, maintain a kind of messiness that's actually more historically honest than any official preservation could be. Some houses get restored to period appearance. Others get modified for contemporary needs. Some are maintained as rentals. Others become family homes again. The neighborhood that was once uniform becomes diverse, shaped by the accumulated choices of people living their lives rather than following a master plan. This is memory working through property, through inheritance, through the accumulated small decisions of people who didn't ask to become custodians of history, but find themselves in that position anyway. And at institutions like Fair Lane and the Ford House, a different kind of inheritance work is happening. Professional historians, archivists, and educators are grappling with how to present complicated legacies to public audiences who come with their own expectations and assumptions. The scaffolding came down from Fair Lane's East Wing in 2019, after years of restoration work funded by donations that arrived slowly, in amounts too modest for headlines but too necessary to refuse. The people doing this work, stonemasons and carpenters and preservation specialists, understood that they weren't just repairing a building. They were making choices about which version of the past would be visible to future visitors. Every restoration involves these choices. Do you recreate the house exactly as it appeared in 1920? Or do you show the layers, the changes, the accumulation of different eras? Do you hide the servants' infrastructure or make it visible? Do you present the family's perspective or try to recover the workers' experiences? Fair Lane's current interpretation tries, with varying success, to do something difficult, present the house as both architectural achievement and instrument of control. to acknowledge Henry Ford's genuine innovations while also examining the human costs of his systems. This balance is delicate and probably impossible to get perfectly right. Some visitors come wanting hero worship and feel uncomfortable when tours discuss surveillance and labor control. Others arrive convinced that Ford was purely villainous and resist any acknowledgement of his contributions to industrial development or worker welfare. The truth, as always, is more complicated than either position allows. Ford did revolutionize manufacturing. He did pay wages that changed workers' lives. He did create opportunities for people who'd been excluded from industrial prosperity. And he did all of that through systems that treated human beings as components to be managed, that invaded privacy in ways we'd now consider intolerable, that assumed his vision of proper living should override workers' autonomy. These aren't contradictions to be resolved. They're contradictions to be held simultaneously. Historical figures contain multitudes. Systems produce benefits and harms at the same time. The question isn't whether Ford was good or evil. It's what we learn from examining how someone genuinely committed to human improvement built systems that were deeply dehumanizing. Younger staff at Fair Lane and the Ford House, many of them in their 20s and 30s, push harder than their older colleagues to center workers' experiences. They advocate for tours that begin in servants' quarters rather than grand halls. They develop programming that invites visitors to think about whose labor made this beauty possible. They push back against narratives that treat domestic workers as background characters in someone else's story. This generational shift in interpretation mirrors larger cultural changes. Audiences today expect museums to grapple with uncomfortable histories rather than presenting sanitized versions of the past. They want to know about slavery, about exploitation, about the people who paid the price for someone else's wealth and vision. But institutions move slowly. Donor boards include people with emotional attachments to particular versions of history. Tour scripts go through multiple approval processes. Changes that seem obvious to front-line educators get delayed or diluted by institutional caution. Still, the direction of change is clear. The mansions of Ford's empire are gradually becoming less about celebrating one man's genius and more about understanding how systems of power operate, how wealth is created and sustained, how beauty and exploitation coexist. This matters beyond these specific sites, because the patterns visible at Fair Lane and Fordlandia aren't unique to Ford. They're patterns that run through the entire history of industrial capitalism, the tension between paternalistic care and invasive control. The use of housing to bind workers to employers, the exportation of supposedly universal systems to places where they don't fit, the certainty that those with power know better than those with lived experience. These patterns persist today in forms adapted for contemporary circumstances. Tech companies that provide meals, housing, and recreation while expecting availability around the clock. Corporations that track employee wellness data and adjust benefits based on health metrics. Planned communities governed by homeowners associations that regulate behavior in ways that echo Ford's Sociological Department. The mansions, in other words, aren't just historical curiosities. They're laboratories where we can study the DNA of systems that still shape working life today. The specific mechanisms have changed, but the underlying impulse, the desire of employers to extend control beyond the workplace into workers' entire lives, remains remarkably consistent. Understanding Ford's empire helps us see contemporary patterns more clearly, helps us recognize when care is actually control, helps us question systems that present themselves as beneficial while steadily expanding their reach into domains that should remain private. This is why preservation matters, not to honor Ford or any other individual, but to maintain physical evidence of how power operates. To create spaces where people can study these systems, can see their architecture and infrastructure, can understand that the beautiful house and the surveillance systems aren't separate but deeply interconnected. Fair Lane's restoration, then, isn't primarily about saving a building. It's about maintaining a teaching tool. A place where the distance of history allows us to see patterns that are harder to recognize in our own moment, when we're living inside them, when we're benefiting from paychecks that come with conditions we don't quite examine. The work continues. Slowly, imperfectly, with limited funds and competing interpretations and all the messiness that comes with trying to tell complicated truths about powerful people and the systems they built. But it continues. Because the alternative, letting these places crumble or preserving them only as monuments to genius, would mean losing crucial evidence about how we arrived at our current arrangements of power and work and control. In a graduate seminar at the University of Michigan Dearborn, a student named David presents 3 years of dissertation research. His screen shows maps overlaying maps, timelines crossing and knotting, photographs from different eras placed side by side. His thesis, Ford's empire wasn't an aberration, it was a template. The techniques Ford normalized, company housing tied to employment, domestic surveillance disguised as welfare, architectural design used to shape behavior, didn't vanish when his experiments ended. They evolved. They spread. They were adapted by other corporations, other institutions, other systems of power that found his methods useful. David traces these lineages carefully, aware that correlation doesn't equal causation, that similar forms can emerge from different motives. But the patterns are difficult to ignore. The Sociological Department's home inspection protocols echo in modern employment background checks that examine social media histories and personal networks. The conditional nature of Ford housing reappears in corporate relocation packages that offer subsidized homes while deepening dependence on the employer. The standardized workers' streets prefigure suburban subdivisions where homeowners' associations regulate everything from mailbox height to acceptable holiday decorations. His slides advance. Fair Lane appears alongside corporate campuses that include apartments, gyms, cafeterias, designed to keep employees on site as many hours as possible. The Fordlandia Hospital shares a frame with contemporary wellness programs that track step counts and sleep patterns, adjusting insurance premiums accordingly. The worker housing sits opposite new workforce housing complexes where teachers and nurses live in employer-subsidized units they'll lose if they change jobs. The classroom discussion becomes heated. Some students argue that David is overstating continuities, that modern workplaces are nothing like Ford's authoritarian system. Others counter that the control has simply become more sophisticated, more embedded in technology, harder to see but not necessarily weaker. Both positions have merit. Contemporary employers rarely send inspectors into kitchens to check cleanliness. But they do monitor email and track productivity through software. They don't explicitly prohibit alcohol, but they do conduct random drug testing. They don't require church attendance, but they do evaluate culture fit in ways that enforce conformity to unwritten standards. The tools have changed. The fundamental impulse, the desire to extend organizational influence beyond the workplace into employees' entire lives, persists. David's most provocative claim, that we're currently living through an expansion of employer control that rivals Ford's era. That smartphone notifications carrying workplace demands into bedrooms and vacations. That remote work bringing monitoring software into family living rooms. That the dissolution of boundaries between professional and personal time. All of this represents a victory for the logic Ford pioneered. The factory whistle that marked the end of the workday has been replaced by notification chimes that never fully stop. The physical control of company towns has been replaced by digital systems that track location, communication, even physiological data. The inspectors who visited homes have been replaced by algorithms that analyze behavior patterns and flag anomalies for human review. Is this too stark? Is David drawing connections that oversimplify complex historical developments? Maybe. Probably. Historical analysis always involves interpretation, always risks seeing patterns that are partially imposed by the analyst's perspective rather than purely present in the evidence. But there's something clarifying about his approach. By mapping these lineages, by tracing how Ford's specific methods diffused through corporate culture, David makes visible systems that usually operate beneath conscious awareness. He denaturalizes arrangements we take for granted. He invites us to ask, why do we accept these intrusions? What are we getting in exchange? Could work be organized differently? These aren't just historical questions, they're urgent contemporary ones. The seminar ends without resolution, as good seminars should. Students file out still arguing, still testing their positions against each other's counterarguments. David packs up his laptop, aware that his dissertation will satisfy no one completely. Those who want pure condemnation of Ford will find too much acknowledgement of his innovations. Those who want celebration of American industrial genius will find too much focus on exploitation and control. But satisfying everyone isn't the point. The point is mapping terrain accurately enough that others can navigate it, can use his research to develop their own understanding, can see connections they might otherwise miss. The empire Ford built was specific to its moment. The technologies available in 1920 created certain possibilities and limitations. Social attitudes about workers' rights, corporate responsibility, government regulation, all of these shaped what Ford could attempt and how it played out. We live in a different moment with different technologies and somewhat different social attitudes. The empire being built now has different architecture. But the fundamental question remains the same. How much control should employers have over employees' lives? Where should the line be drawn between legitimate business interest and impermissible intrusion? Ford's mansions, his workers' houses, his jungle city, these offer evidence for thinking through that question. They show us what total control looks like when it's achieved. They show us what it costs, even when it comes wrapped in good wages and decent housing. And they show us something else. That control eventually fails. That systems designed to last forever come apart. That the people targeted for transformation outlast the systems trying to transform them. This might be the most important lesson the empire teaches. Morning light falls on Fair Lane differently now. The last scaffolding has come down. For the first time in decades, nothing interrupts the roof line or hides the stonework. The limestone glows as it did a century ago, though the house it encloses serves purposes its builder never planned. A visitor walks up the path toward the main entrance. She's not wealthy. She carries no invitation. She bought a ticket online, drove from a modest apartment in a nearby city, parked in a lot that once held the cars of industrialists and diplomats. The brass doorknob turns beneath her hand. The same knob Henry Ford grasped. The same metal servants touched as they moved through their hidden routines. The same threshold that once marked a hard line between those who belonged and those who served. She steps inside. The great hall opens before her. Other visitors move through the space at their own pace. Families with distracted children, elderly couples taking slow steps, students with notebooks, tourists speaking languages that never reached these walls when Ford lived here. The house has become a place of questions rather than commands. A space where anyone who can get here and afford admission can walk in, look around, and decide for themselves what they think. This transformation from private control to public access is meaningful, but it's also incomplete. Admission fees, even modest ones, exclude some people. Geographic location makes access easier for some communities than others. The narratives presented in Tour, however improved from earlier versions, still center primarily on the Ford family rather than the workers who made the family's life possible. Perfect preservation doesn't exist. Every choice about what to save and how to present it involves compromise and exclusion. The question is whether we're moving toward more honest accounting or simply finding new ways to celebrate power while paying lip service to those who were subject to it. Outside Fair Lane, the Rouge River continues its patient movement. The powerhouse turbines turn, generating electricity for classrooms and exhibits rather than a single family's private grid. The system Ford designed still works, but its output has been socialized, made available to purposes beyond one man's vision of self-sufficiency. Across Dearborn, the workers' streets ease into another ordinary day. Children wait for school buses on sidewalks their great-great-grandparents walked under worried observation. The houses are painted in shades the Sociological Department would never have approved. Gardens follow personal taste rather than company regulations. The neighborhood breathes on its own now, shaped by the accumulated decisions of residents rather than dictated from above. It's not perfect. Property values have created new pressures. Gentrification threatens to price out families who have lived here for generations. Historic preservation restrictions meant to protect sometimes burden people trying to adapt homes to contemporary needs. But these are problems of the present, not the past. The specific form of control Ford imposed has ended, even as new forms continue to emerge. At Gawkler Point, the lake catches morning sun. Staff unlock doors and prepare for the day's visitors. The house that was Edsel and Aliner's retreat is now a museum, a wedding venue, a public garden. The art collection remains intact, preserved as Aliner intended, accessible to anyone who visits. This is partial redemption. The wealth extracted from workers at the Rouge plant has been converted into cultural resources available to the public. It's not justice, it doesn't undo the exploitation, but it's better than the alternative where everything would have been sold and scattered. And in Fordlandia, under the rusted water tower, another day begins. Families make breakfast, head to work and school, live complete lives in a place that was supposed to be temporary and became permanent through sheer stubborn survival. The town that was built as an empire's experiment has become a community defined by the people who refused to disappear when the empire lost interest. The American buildings remain, but they're no longer American in any meaningful sense. They're Brazilian, inhabited and adapted and transformed by decades of use that had nothing to do with Ford's original vision. This might be the clearest victory over the empire, that the people it tried to reshape instead reshaped what it built, that the systems designed to control were eventually controlled, repurposed, turned into something the designers never imagined and couldn't prevent. A child stands in Fair Lane's great hall, neck craned back, trying to make sense of the ceiling's height and the room's vast scale. Her classmates have scattered through the space, but she stays rooted, pinned by a question that arrives unbidden. Why did they need all this room? No worksheet prompted this. No teacher suggested it. The question emerges from the simple confrontation between her everyday experience, a small apartment, shared bedroom, kitchen where three people can barely move simultaneously, and this space that seems to swallow sound and people, that was designed for a household of two. Her teacher notices and kneels to the child's level. What are you thinking about? Why did they need all this room? It's the question that haunts every corner of Ford's empire. The 56 rooms at Fair Lane. The rows of workers' homes laid out like products on an assembly line. The entire American town carved from Amazon jungle. Each one was an answer to unspoken questions about how life should be organized, about who deserves space and beauty and autonomy, about whose vision of order should govern everyone else's existence. The answers Ford gave were sincere. He genuinely believed in improvement, genuinely thought the right systems could lift people, eliminate suffering, create a better world. His vision of order was progress, not tyranny, at least in his own mind. But belief doesn't erase consequence. Good intentions don't prevent harm. The systems Ford built to help workers also controlled them. The houses that provided running water and heat also came with surveillance. The wages that changed lives also came with conditions about how those lives should be lived. This is the fundamental lesson the mansions teach. That paternalism, no matter how well-meaning, remains a form of domination. That when someone else decides what's best for you, even when they're partially right, they're stealing your autonomy. That the systems claiming to serve your interests always serve someone else's first. The child won't solve any of this today. She'll rejoin her group, see more rooms, hear more facts, eventually board a bus that takes her home to her ordinary life. But something has lodged in her mind, a tiny shift in how she sees space and power. A sense that houses aren't neutral, that rooms tell stories about the people who designed them and the people who were never supposed to be visible inside them. Perhaps she'll return someday older, armed with different questions. Perhaps she'll become one of the researchers or preservationists who carry this story forward. Perhaps she'll simply remember this moment, the vastness of the hall, the strangeness of such scale, the first flicker of doubt about how the world is arranged and who benefits. The Great Hall waits. It has witnessed industrialists and servants, protesters and tourists, decades of interpretations and reinterpretations. It will witness more as long as the building stands, as long as people keep arriving with questions. The empire Henry Ford built exists now primarily as questions. Questions about power and its limits, about the line between help and control, about whose vision gets to shape the spaces where others live. About how we remember complicated figures who did real good and real harm simultaneously. These questions don't have final answers. Each generation responds according to its own values, its own understanding of what human beings owe each other, its own tolerance for systems that promise security while demanding submission. The child looks up at the ceiling one last time. Then she runs to rejoin her classmates, leaving the hall to its echoes and its waiting, patient as stone, for the next person who will stand in that same spot, look up and wonder. The brass doorknob at Fair Lane has been touched perhaps 1,000,000 times. Hands in white gloves during formal dinners, calloused palms of workers delivering supplies, fingers of children running through rooms their parents cleaned but never owned, curious visitors trying to understand what this all means. The metal has worn smooth in places, shaped by all those contacts, all those entrances and exits, all those moments when someone stood at the threshold deciding whether to enter or leave. Objects outlast people. Buildings outlast their builders. The physical remnants of Ford's empire will survive longer than anyone who remembers what it felt like to live inside his systems. Eventually, Fair Lane and Fordlandia and all these places will become pure history, their meaning determined entirely by scholars and interpreters who never experienced them firsthand. This distance is both loss and opportunity. Loss, because lived experience can never be fully captured in archives and oral histories. The texture of daily life, the constant low-level anxiety of surveillance, the small humiliations and small kindnesses that made up workers, reality, much of this becomes invisible once the last people who remember it are gone. But distance also creates opportunity for honesty. The people who lived through Ford's empire couldn't always speak freely. They depended on wages and housing that could vanish if they complained too loudly. Gratitude and resentment mixed together in ways that made clear judgment difficult. We inherit their silence and their fragments. We get to assemble them into narratives they couldn't safely tell. We get to name things they had to leave unnamed. This is the work of inheritance, taking what remains and deciding what it means. Not discovering some hidden truth that was always there waiting, but constructing understanding from partial evidence, aware that our constructions reflect our own moment as much as the past we're trying to understand. The empire Henry Ford built was designed to last. The factories would outlast workers. The houses would outlast tenants. The systems would perpetuate themselves, maintaining order across generations. It hasn't worked that way. The factories are mostly gone. The formal systems of control have collapsed. What remains are fragments, buildings occupied by people with their own purposes, documents in archives waiting for researchers with new questions, photographs that capture moments but can never fully explain them, and memories growing thinner each year as the last people who lived through the empire's height pass away. These fragments don't add up to a simple story. They don't support comfortable conclusions about genius or villainy, progress or exploitation. They're just evidence of how people tried to organize life and work, of what those attempts cost and who paid, of how the people targeted for transformation found ways to resist and survive and eventually outlast the systems trying to control them. If this investigation has accomplished anything, it's been to make visible what institutional narratives often hide. That the beautiful houses rested on foundations of human control, that the advancement of some required the submission of others, that the mansions and the surveillance were not separate but deeply interconnected parts of a single vision. Henry Ford believed he was building a better world. He was genuinely convinced that his systems would lift people, eliminate waste, create prosperity that would benefit everyone eventually. He saw his control not as domination but as guidance, not as exploitation but as improvement. And he was partially right. His methods did create wealth and opportunity. They did improve living conditions for many workers. They did make automobiles accessible to ordinary families and help build a middle class. But those achievements came with costs that Ford never fully acknowledged and that institutional histories often minimize. The surveillance, the cultural erasure, the invasion of privacy, the conditional nature of every benefit, the message that workers couldn't be trusted to manage their own lives, all of this was damage that the good wages and decent housing couldn't erase. We inherit both, the achievements and the costs, the innovations and the harm. We get to decide which lessons to carry forward, which patterns to recognize and resist in our own time. Because the patterns persist. The specific mechanisms change, but the impulse remains. Employers wanting to extend control beyond the workplace, systems promising security in exchange for submission, visions of improvement that require those being improved to surrender autonomy they'll never fully recover. Fair Lane's door swings open each morning for visitors who come seeking different things. Some want inspiration from Ford's genius. Others want confirmation of his villainy. Most arrive without strong opinions, just curious about a famous house and the man who built it. What they encounter, if the interpretation is honest, is complexity that resists simple judgment. A man who was neither hero nor villain, but both, simultaneously. Systems that were neither purely beneficial nor purely exploitative, but contained elements of each. A history that offers no comfortable conclusions, only evidence for thinking more carefully about power, control, autonomy, and the price of other people's visions. The empire Henry Ford built is gone, but its architecture remains, asking questions that each generation must answer for itself. Not questions with right answers that can be looked up and memorized, but questions that force us to examine our own assumptions about work and worth, about what employers should be allowed to demand and what workers should have to sacrifice, about where the line falls between legitimate authority and impermissible intrusion. These are not historical questions. They're present tense. They're urgent. And the mansions, standing patient as stone, wait to teach anyone willing to look beyond the carefully restored beauty to see the systems that beauty was built to hide. The door remains open. The questions remain unanswered. The work of understanding continues, carried forward by each person who stands at that threshold, looks in, and decides what they see. If this investigation challenged what you thought you knew about American industrial history, if it made you see historic mansions and corporate benefits differently, if it helped you recognize patterns of control that persist in modern workplaces, then this research has served its purpose. But the work doesn't end here. There are dozens of other industrial empires whose histories remain buried beneath official narratives. Carnegie's libraries that came with conditions. Rockefeller's company towns. The Vanderbilt estates built on railroad fortunes that destroyed entire communities. The tech campuses being built today with the same logic Ford pioneered. Comprehensive care that's actually comprehensive control. Which empire should we investigate next? What hidden history needs exposure? What carefully maintained myth needs examination? Tell me in the comments. Your suggestions guide this channel's direction. Your engagement makes this research sustainable. If you found value in this deep investigation, please like this video. It helps the algorithm understand that audiences want substantive historical analysis, not just surface-level content. Subscribe to the channel if you want more investigations like this. If you want history that doesn't sanitize power, that doesn't mistake wealth for virtue, that tries to tell the whole story including the parts institutions prefer to forget. Share this with anyone studying labor history, architecture, industrial development, or the persistent question of how much control employers should have over workers' lives. Share it with anyone who thinks historic preservation is just about saving pretty buildings and needs to understand that every beautiful house has a hidden history. And if you're able, consider supporting this work directly through the channel membership or Patreon. Deep research takes time. Archival access costs money. This kind of investigation can't be done quickly or cheaply. Your support makes it possible to keep pursuing these stories, to keep asking uncomfortable questions, to keep examining the foundations beneath the beautiful facades. The empire Henry Ford built tried to control how history would remember him. He created museums, carefully managed his public image, built monuments that would shape how future generations understood his work. We don't have to accept that controlled narrative. We can dig deeper, ask harder questions, center the voices Ford tried to keep invisible. We can use the evidence he left behind to understand not just what he built, but what it cost and who paid. That's the work. That's what this channel does. And your support, your engagement, your willingness to sit through a 15,000-word investigation instead of clicking away to easier content, that's what makes this work possible. Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking critically about power and history. Thank you for being part of an audience that wants substance over spectacle. More investigations are coming. More hidden empires will be exposed. More carefully maintained myths will be examined until they crack open and reveal what's actually inside. Stay curious, stay critical, and I'll see you in the next investigation.